This photograph was taken at 9:16 p.m. By 9:17 p.m., everyone in the room was dead. There were no signs of violence, no broken furniture, no blood, no suicide note. The door was locked from the inside. The windows were sealed by snow. 5 adults stood side by side for a simple group picture inside a remote mountain lodge in January 1908. The camera was placed on a tripod. The exposure took several seconds. They did not look scared. They were calm. When a search party entered the lodge 4 days later, the bodies were still in the same positions shown in the photograph, standing upright, facing the camera. What happened inside that room remains one of the strangest unexplained death cases of the early 20th century. The incident took place in January 1908 in a remote alpine region near the border of modern-day Austria and northern Italy. At the time, the area was difficult to access during winter. Heavy snow blocked the mountain paths for weeks. The lodge had been built in 1891 as a private retreat for wealthy travelers. It was isolated, surrounded by dense forest and steep terrain. During winter, there were no nearby residents within 12 miles. In early January, 5 people rented the lodge for a short stay. 2 brothers from Vienna, a married couple from Innsbruck, and a local mountain guide familiar with the terrain. Archived municipal records confirm their arrival date. Weather reports confirm that a severe snowstorm began the same evening. They were expected to return to the nearest village after 3 nights. They never did. When the storm cleared and no one came back, villagers organized a search party. What they found inside the lodge did not match any known accident, crime, or natural disaster. The search team arrived 4 days after the group was last seen. Snow had piled against the entrance. The main door was bolted from the inside. They forced entry. Inside, the air was cold but undisturbed. The fireplace had burned out. The dining table still held plates with leftover food. There were no signs of panic. All 5 bodies were located in the main sitting room. They were not collapsed on the floor. They were standing upright, positioned almost exactly as shown in the photograph later found inside the camera. The camera was still mounted on a tripod. The photographic plate had not been removed. It appeared as if someone had calmly finished taking the picture and then placed the equipment back carefully. Medical examination at the nearest town showed no external injuries, no fractures, no defensive wounds. There was no blood in the room, no broken glass, no signs of struggle. The official report described the scene as orderly. That word confused investigators for decades. Doctors initially suspected poisoning, However, early toxicology testing in 1908 was limited. They tested for common substances such as arsenic and cyanide. Results were negative. Carbon monoxide was considered. The fireplace chimney was inspected. It was clear. There was no evidence of blockage. Hypothermia was unlikely. The room was enclosed, and their bodies were not found in typical collapse positions associated with freezing. The most unusual detail was timing. One of the victims carried a pocket watch. It had stopped at 9:17 p.m. The photographic plate, once developed, confirmed the exposure had been taken at approximately 9:16 p.m. based on the mechanical timing device attached to the camera. If accurate, that leaves roughly 1 minute between the photograph and death. All 5 individuals appear relaxed in the image. No visible distress, no abnormal posture. There were no additional footprints outside the lodge beyond those of the group when they arrived. No signs of intrusion, no evidence of forced entry. The door remained locked from the inside. The case was officially recorded as sudden cardiac failure. 5 simultaneous cardiac failures in healthy adults. That explanation satisfied the paperwork. It did not satisfy the people who saw the scene. In February 1908, local newspapers briefly reported the deaths as a tragic winter incident. The official cause listed was sudden cardiac failure. The articles were short and avoided speculation. However, archived municipal correspondence from the same month suggests the investigation was not considered routine. A letter between regional officials described the scene as highly unusual and recommended further review. That review was never publicly released. One of the victims, Carl Brenner, had written a letter 2 days before the incident. The letter was addressed to his sister in Vienna. It was recovered from his luggage inside the lodge. In it, he mentioned that the group had been hearing unexplained sounds at night. He described slow footsteps in the corridor outside the bedrooms. He wrote that the guide had checked the hallway and found nothing. He did not describe fear, he described confusion. That letter was referenced in early police notes, but never mentioned in newspaper coverage. The original document is now stored in a regional archive, but access is restricted. In 1923, 15 years after the incident, a secondary review was conducted when ownership of the lodge changed hands. A legal assessment required re-examination of the death certificates. The reviewing physician at the time questioned the simultaneous cardiac failure conclusion. His handwritten notes state, 5 healthy adults, no prior known cardiac condition, timing appears synchronized. Despite that observation, the cause of death was not amended. In the 1970s, the photograph itself underwent forensic reanalysis using improved imaging techniques. A photography expert examined the original glass plate negative. His report identified what he described as a shadow irregularity near the doorway behind the group. The anomaly did not match common exposure defects of early 20th century cameras. It did not match light bleed or chemical damage patterns typically seen in deteriorated plates. However, the expert stopped short of suggesting manipulation or an additional figure. He concluded that the irregularity was structurally inconsistent with background lighting. That phrase generated renewed interest in the case among local historians. Another detail began to attract attention: the timing device attached to the camera. Early mechanical timers were designed to trigger long exposure photographs. Investigators in 1908 documented that the device appeared intact and functional. This means someone deliberately set the timer, positioned the group, and initiated the exposure. After the photograph was taken, the camera remained mounted. The plate was not removed. There is no sign that anyone attempted to flee, collapse, or disrupt the setup. Gas poisoning was revisited multiple times over the decades. Some researchers proposed a natural gas leak from underground geological formations. The alpine region does contain pockets of naturally occurring gases in certain areas. However, there were no burn marks, no ventilation anomalies, no discoloration of the walls or ceiling. Modern environmental surveys conducted in the 1990s did not identify abnormal gas concentrations around the lodge site. Carbon monoxide remains unlikely. The chimney was inspected and documented as clear. There was no soot blockage. The fireplace structure showed no structural damage. Another theory suggested psychological influence or mass hysteria. But mass hysteria does not typically result in synchronized death without physical trauma. There were no seizures, no overturned furniture, no defensive posture. The bodies were described in reports as upright and balanced. One of the most controversial aspects of the case involves a missing supplemental police report. According to archived indexing logs from 1908, a secondary document labeled Addendum B was filed 3 days after the primary investigation summary. That document is no longer in the archive. The index confirms its existence. The contents are unknown. Some researchers believe it may have included witness testimony from members of the search party. Early oral accounts from villagers described an unusual silence inside the lodge, described as heavy or pressurized. Those descriptions never appeared in formal documentation. There are also inconsistencies in how the bodies were described over time. Initial reports state that the victims were standing. Later summaries describe them as found upright. The distinction is subtle but important. Were they fully standing unsupported, or partially supported by nearby furniture? The original forensic sketches are limited and lack detailed anatomical positioning. Another detail, the oil lamp. When investigators entered the lodge, the lamp still contained fuel. It had burned for some time, but not completely. If the group died immediately after the photograph, who extinguished the flame, or did it burn out naturally? Records do not clarify. By 1910, public discussion of the case had almost disappeared. There were no follow-up investigations, no criminal charges, no official declaration of foul play. The lodge was sold. Ownership transferred quietly. The deaths were categorized as unexplained but non-criminal. In modern terms, the case would likely be classified as unexplained simultaneous death under unknown environmental factors. But over a century later, no environmental factor has been confirmed. No poison was detected, no weapon was found, no intruder was identified, and no definitive medical explanation accounts for 5 simultaneous deaths within what appears to be a 1-minute window. The photograph remains the final verified moment. 5 individuals, calm posture, normal expression, seconds before death. The documentation raises more questions than it answers, and one archival reference, Addendum B, remains missing. The lodge was abandoned within a year. Ownership transferred twice. No one stayed there permanently again. The original photograph is still archived in a regional historical collection. No definitive cause of death has ever been confirmed. No evidence of murder. No confirmed environmental hazard. Just 5 people standing calmly in a photograph, and 1 minute later, they were gone. More than a century later, historians still debate what happened inside that mountain lodge in January 1908. But the most disturbing detail remains unchanged. They did not look afraid.